Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Buyouts, Business, and Bourbon. And I'm very excited about our guest today, Chris Gibson. He's got so much experience in so many different areas that it's going to be hard to make this a one-part podcast. That's the truth. I've known Chris, it's hard to believe, more than 30 years at this point. And we share a lot of things. We both love pickup basketball over the years, which we've, of course, now given up. But we're long-standing, suffering Jet fans as well. But we're not here to talk about those two things today. But I would like to get into a lot of other topics. Chris has a brand new book out that we'll talk about, Spirit of Philadelphia. We'll talk about that. I know he's written other books as well. Chris is also an academic leader. He's been president of University, Siena. We'll talk a little bit about that because he took over during the beginning of COVID. I'm sure that was a challenge, as we know. Military experience, extensive over the years. Spent tours in Iraq, and we'll talk about that. And your time in Congress, including probably a little known fact, even though it was well known in the papers, was that you announced a candidacy against Governor Cuomo at one point. I don't know exactly what year that was. I'm sure you do. But we'll talk a little bit about that too. But I mean, the overriding theme, Chris, is your teaching on leadership and getting the next generation, even when it kind of moves toward all your experience into the business world, which I know you haven't spent a lot of time in the true business world, but I know you understand leadership and executive presence and developing leadership skills and what makes a great leader. Because I think that a lot of the businesses that we talk to about succession planning and selling their business and moving to the next generation involves developing leadership skills and how to evaluate those traits. So I don't know where you'd like to start, but we could start with a little bit about your current book and talk about like what that's all about and then move on from there.
As I think about, your leading question, for me, when I was considering, what is this next project I'm going to take on? Probably like a lot of the viewers out there, I was looking out and saying, what the heck has happened to our country? What is going on that we seem to really struggle to have, even in a civil conversation? We have issues with vitriolic exchanges. We have distrust in our institutions and leaders, dysfunction in government. That was really those were the leading questions that took me into this research. And I went all the way back to the beginning of the country, to the founding. And even though I had read extensively in the past about this, when I went into this research project, I learned quite a bit. And I think what should be encouraging to the viewers today, to the listeners today, is the fact that the founders actually, in my view, had it harder. The fact of the matter is we don't really think about it that often, but our young country, as the delegates arrived in Philadelphia, they were not only struggling, they were seriously staring at failure. The Articles of Confederation, which was our initial constitution, had in fact destabilized the new country. We had states that were putting tariffs on other states that were considering entering into trade and security arrangements with other nations. We had insurrections. The one that the previous year was the Shays Rebellion. Folks will remember that from school. But the short of it is, had our leaders not come together and brought forward the Constitution, we would have been yet another example of a young country that had failed. We did not fail. We not only survived, we flourished. And so my book, The Spirit of Philadelphia, A Call to Recover Founding Principles, is really America's story. It's told through the history of ideas. It's also a cautionary tale of what can happen when a nation's spirit, and I go in great detail about spirit, a psychological, a coalescing energy that can bring people together, when that spirit goes dormant. That's a challenge we have right now. So I hope you'll read it and think about it. And then I hope you reach out to me. I've got a website, thespiritofphiladelphia.com. And I'm spending a couple hours a day now with folks all across the country who have read it, thought about it, and we're going back and forth on a number of different things. So if you find yourself wondering what's happened to our country, and more importantly, what we should do about it, you should read this book, The Spirit of Philadelphia.
That's
Thanks.
great. No, that's great, Chris, and that kind of leads me into your whole thesis on developing leadership. I know you taught leadership at West Point, and when you're teaching leadership, why don't you tell us a little bit about developing leaders in the military? Because tell us a little bit about your military background, and also, I know you mentioned that part of your role in the military in teaching is developing leaders in the military. And what do you look for, and how do you recognize really the next leaders? What do those traits look like? And then, like again, tell us a little bit about your history because I know you have extensive history in the military.
So thanks, Jerry. And I think that there'll be at least three areas as we go through this that'll really, I hope, resonate for you, our small business owners out there that are really looking at forming the team. How do you bring a group of folks together and really get them in the same spot? Get them to have love of the values of your company, the mission of your company. How do you prepare leaders to step in when it's time for you to move to the next phase of your life and to strengthen your organization? Leader development, and then also closely related risk management. How do you make the right choices, particularly under pressure, as you are? How do you do that? And so, that really for the military, you can imagine, and many, I think, of the viewers out there, listeners out there, have military experience, can relate to what I'm saying here. But as we said growing up, I was an infantryman. So, I started for at least 2 seconds. I was the lowest ranking person in the country. In 1981, I was a junior in high school, 17 years old. Day past my 17th birthday when I raised my right hand. And I went from being the lowest ranking person, ultimately across 29 years, I rose to the rank of colonel. I was a brigade commander in the 82nd Airborne Division and had 4 combat tours in Iraq. Also had a peace enforcement NATO mission to Kosovo and the Balkans, and was on a counter-drug operation. And then also, right before retirement, led a humanitarian relief operation to Haiti after that devastating earthquake in 2010. Leader development. Well, I think it starts with self-awareness. This is so important. And, there's one piece there's so many. There's so many different things you'd want to read, but I would strongly recommend Daniel Goleman's piece on emotional intelligence, EI, or emotional intelligence. This initially was published by the Harvard Business Review. You can just Google Goleman, emotional intelligence. It'll come up. And I think that piece, I not only used it extensively in the military, I used it in academia. I taught my students not only at West Point, but also at Williams College and Siena College. We would go over this piece on emotional intelligence because I've actually used it myself. It's helped me grow, learn from my mistakes, and to help other leaders over the years. And so, emotional intelligence is essentially 5 different elements. The first is self-awareness. Who are you? The old Delphic command, know thyself. What are your strengths? What are your challenges? What are your triggers? The hope of self-awareness. And, there are tests for this. The Myers-Briggs is a time-honored, tested one. I've used it. It really gave great insights for me. But the whole point of self-awareness is to then do something about it. So self-awareness leads to self-regulation. So how do you both avoid pitfalls in your own, challenges with your own personalities and with the mission? But then importantly, because I've often said this to my leaders in my units and also as a teacher, good leaders, solve problems. Great leaders not only solve problems, but seize opportunities. And I think too often I watch leader development and I even watch leaders in practice and they'll miss opportunities. Partly, they're naturally concerned about taking too much risk or making a mistake, but it
What's an
is,
example of that, Chris? Did somebody
yeah.
that you watched
So,
miss an opportunity that really was there for the taking?
so, to me, it had to do at Siena College when I was the president right at the outset of the pandemic. I mean, so many colleges were really, like everyone across the country and the world, what to do. And, given my military experience under fire in Iraq, but also just dealing with risk management, I sought to understand situational awareness, understand my environment, and make the best decisions that I could. What that meant ultimately is I communicated very clearly to prospective parents. And, I did a series of town hall meetings with families who were considering sending their son or daughter to Siena College. The result of all that is we broke records as far as enrollments. So even today, when you hear about colleges, maybe even in your nearby area, failing, going under, going bankrupt, Siena College flourished during the period of the pandemic because we made choices. It was about the right choices. So for example, my college, we went mask optional a year and a half before anyone else. And that came from reading the science and not dwelling, certainly being prudent, making prudent decisions as far as protection, but also recognizing that for 18 to 22-year-olds, the risk really wasn't existential for young folks. So it was, how do I protect my faculty so that we could do in-person instruction and seminar, and that the students could have the closest semblance of a college life possible. The result of all that risk management, not that I had a small vocal part of my faculty who really wanted to do it like everybody else, do Zoom education, to do, triple mask and everything like that. We actually were very careful, but we actually allowed the students to go mask optional. We did in-person instruction. Consequence of that is that students and parents chose Siena. And when they chose Siena, 82% of revenues at a college come from parents. And so
Siena's in that high risk profile, right? With a small privately held
yeah,
college.
well,
So
that's
that you
true.
need to make good decisions, yeah.
We have to, but we did, and that's an example. What to your point on how important this is for leader development, to really dial in and make sure you're making the right choices. You're balancing risk, and because of that, our college flourished. We actually made the Wall Street Journal. We're in the top 2% now in the nation. We're perennially now in the top 10 of Catholic colleges. And we raised the money. We ran from, when I took over, we had deficits. We went to surpluses. So, I use that as an example, but that's just one example. In the military, what was really important is getting our paratroopers comfortable in their decision making in a counterinsurgency environment. I mean, so much of what the terrorists would do in Iraq was try to get the U.S. forces to make mistakes, to kill innocent people, because it really detracted from our mission and for the people supporting us. And so as we were working to train the Iraqi army and the Iraqi security forces, I had to have paratroopers who were very confident. So what I did is we went through extensive, back at home station at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, we went through extensive shoot, no shoot scenarios. And then we would drill it. Sadly, a common occurrence that would happen in Iraq is vehicles would be like just speeding towards checkpoints of soldiers, and inexperienced soldiers would shoot at it. And sometimes it was just a mistake. Iraqis were concerned. So they may appear like terrorists, but they're not. So what I did is got our paratroopers comfortable, because very few people really want soldiers to risk their lives to the point of dying, trying to be overly cautious. That's not really where America is. But at the same time, we don't want to make mistakes. So what I did in a training environment is just constantly run these scenarios by our troops, so then they actually could see, how do you distinguish? Like if that vehicle's bearing down on you and you see more than one person in the vehicle, odds are it's just a mistake. They're just scared. Because what the correlation with suicide bombers in vehicles is, they didn't used to waste. They just put one suicide bomber. That person usually had their head shaven, was wearing white because they expected to go to heaven after they martyred themselves. So if you saw a vehicle with 4 or 5 folks in it, maybe a family, the chances are that they shouldn't be speeding at you. But then we not only help them get confident in making these distinguishing factors, but then we set them up for success by putting obstacles in front of the checkpoint so that the vehicle would have to slow down. And then you would allow the paratrooper to look and see, okay, is the whole vehicle weighted down? Because if it was a suicide bomber, that thing was laden down. I mean, it was almost on the ground as far as driving. So I'm bringing this all up to say that this is very important. Self-awareness leads to self-regulation. I was talking about emotional intelligence. Those are two of your elements for emotional intelligence: self-awareness, self-regulation.
So,
And
Chris,
then,
how many thousands of troops were with you in basically in Iraq, and how do you teach the masses these type
yeah.
of concepts? Because I
Well,
mean, to me, that would be just overwhelming to get everybody to understand these. And I mean, everybody, like, you can't teach this to thousands of people, can you?
Well, so this is why leader development is so important. So, my battalion, I ultimately rose to brigade command, and when I deployed my brigade, it was to a humanitarian relief operation in Haiti. But who knew, right? I could have been back in a combat zone. But my combat experience and training for what you're asking explicitly was at the battalion level. So it was not quite 1,000. It was in 900 some odd paratroopers. And what you do is you actually do train the trainer. So you start by working with your officers. Each battalion had 30 some odd lieutenants. I had a chain of command. I was the battalion commander, but I had 6 company commanders, and in the companies they had 4 to 5 line lieutenants, platoon leaders, if you will. And as the battalion commander, I would work probably about every 2 to 3 weeks with my company commanders on training scenarios, and I'd work with my lieutenants about once a month, once every 4 to 6 weeks. So I spent an extensive amount of time with the leaders, and then of course they in turn would train their units. So when I talk about these exercises, these shoot, no shoot scenarios, we generally did those every 2 to 3 months because we had set the conditions by actually training the leaders, cascading. And I would use the latest information from the theater, including videos, if we had them, so that we could actually give very realistic training to leaders and to troops. And then the way we would do it when we would actually do these exercises is that you didn't put a time. I mean, you couldn't go forever on it, but I mean, the fact of the matter is we did it to standard. So I kind of took the temperature down with my leaders and my paratroopers, said, look, we're just going to do it until we get it right. I mean,
Yeah.
we're going to keep doing it.
I mean, what kind of approach do you take to empower the folks to take ownership of their decisions?
Yeah.
Because I would think that sometimes the decisions, if they're incorrect decisions, you don't want them to quit the military because they made a wrong decision. And if somebody died, they got to move on, right? But I don't know how you empower that with people. And
Well, look, that's an operative. That's like the $10 million question. I mean, frankly, for those experiences we had during the war, because a mistake could end up on CNN. So some commanders, I'm going to say, erred on the side of what you might call micromanaging, because they were concerned that maybe they did 99 things right, and it would only take one mistake like that to end up on international news. I just caution against that. I think what you have to do is trust. You spend so much time forming the team, and that's about values. And the Army has an acronym, leadership. It's LDRSHIP. So it's loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage. So everything you do is surrounding around these values and the mission. So you're forming your team, just like the businesses out there. You have a set of values. You have a mission that you do. Ultimately, what you want to do is have, when people get up in the morning, they can't wait to get to work because they can't wait to make this difference. They know about the values, they know about the mission. It was the same in the Army. And so, we spent so much time on that, forming the team. It was interrelated with leader development, that by the time you got to these exercises, we did it to the point where the paratroopers felt comfortable in their own decision making. And so as the commander, as the battalion commander, I had to just trust the process. Now, we would do a very thorough after action review during training and combat, so that if something didn't go exactly right, we would then revisit it and learn from it. And hopefully we didn't pay a high consequence if we made a mistake, or even, things didn't go exactly as we had hoped. So there is accountability and a follow-up. That's very important, just as with the businesses. You guys do the same thing. I mean, you go through at the end of the week and you take a look at where you're at and you say, all right, what do we need to adjust? I would do the same thing as a leader, but I do caution against the micromanagement, because essentially what you end up with is, I saw it with some of my sister units, is you end up with a reactive unit. And then if the commander's not actually at the spot that a key decision needs to be made, you can make a sin of omission. You could make a mistake because somebody didn't seize an opportunity or they were waiting on some more guidance. You just gotta trust the process and trust your leaders and your troops. And as hard as that is, I mean, I found this to work. I found this to work, and it was acknowledged by some of the senior leaders in Iraq. And so this is why I wrote about it. I know I sent you that piece, Jerry. That was I wrote a piece about my experiences in Iraq in military. So this was published in October of 2006. I think that's also partly what a professional does is share. So just like you're doing this podcast, Jerry, I mean, I love hearing about your experiences, trucking companies in Boston, farms all throughout the country, even NFL players and how I mean, I think that partly what you're doing with this podcast is similar to why I wrote that piece in Military Review, because as a leader, you want to share, the high points and also the challenges going forward.
No, that makes good sense. I mean, Chris, your kind of leadership in companies definitely parallels leadership in military in the sense that you're building out a team and succession planning because obviously you had a good amount of time in military, but you knew your time was over when it was over and you moved on and went to Congress. But I mean, finding your replacement is a big role in business. And when we talk about companies exiting the business of multi-generational businesses. It could be a cement company that their great grandfather started, but the current leader is now aging out and wants to retire or exit and needs leadership. Maybe his kids don't want to come in the business. Maybe they do. And then you're figuring out, do I need a new leader? How do I educate them and get them so that they can kind of take the business to 2 levels beyond, 3 levels beyond? So I think it's important to kind of build out that team and trust that team, just like you're saying. And,
Well, yeah, exactly. And here's part of the challenge for leaders, right? Is you're assessing both performance and potential. And there are nuances between the two. I mean, performance is very clear, right? Is that platoon leader tactically and technically competent to lead that platoon? But when you're trying to identify who's the best next company commander, it's a different skill set. So you're having to extrapolate between current performance and future performance. Now, the military does do some things to help. So the military will broaden your horizon. For example, when I finished my company command, before I was back at the field grade level, I went to graduate school to widen my horizon. I taught at West Point. I went to the Command and General Staff College. And then I was at the field grade level, ultimately battalion, because the military believed you had to invest. You had to invest, yes. I mean, part of leader development is what I'm talking about, this mentorship, this direct counseling, this direct feedback on performance, letting them do it again, learn from mistakes, of course. That's all part of it. But there's a bigger dimension, too, that's important. It's raising the gaze, letting them look over the horizon. And that's partly what I know your listeners have to do. They have to be able to say, all right, I got somebody who's a good frontline supervisor. How well would they make choices, make decisions when it comes to resources, budgeting, leader development themselves? And so, what I did when I was the president of a college is I was very aware of this. So my college actually spent a fair amount of time working with the business community in the greater Albany area. And we listened. We said, what kind of skills do you need? What kind of leadership development do you need? This not only impacted our degrees, our programs that lead towards degrees, but importantly for them, for the businesses, our certificates. So, for example, we heard from businesses that cyber security was really important. And so we altered our program offerings based on what the business said. And then we said, well, how do we make it easier for you? I mean, some of these folks, they can't afford to take them out of their jobs. So we said, okay, instead of taking 18 months to get a certificate, maybe it's going to take 3 years. So they only take one course a semester, but then we offer those at night. And sometimes it's a variegated pedagogy. So, in that sense, maybe once a week, or sometimes even only a few times a semester, would those high performing employees come to Siena. They may actually spend most of that time at work and then on a computer and only coming together for very high payoff educational experiences, and ultimately then the business would get the kind of development of their employee. It was a great way for them to retain too, because that's another challenge is retention. So if you're dealing with your charges and you know that some of them are getting offered from other businesses, one way you can do this is say, you know what, I got a plan for you. I see great potential in you. I see not only your current performance in terms of pay and rewards and incentives, but I want to send you college. I want you to get a certificate or even an MBA or something like that, and I'm gonna pay for that. I'm gonna underwrite that because now you're gonna have to give me a service on the back end. You're gonna have to commit to serving 3, 4 more years, but it's a way of strengthening your retention program. So this is the military used similar approaches to this as well. Before I leave emotional intelligence, I want to list those 5 elements. It was self-awareness leads to self-regulation, motivation, and here I'm not talking about like false motivation. I'm talking about how do you deal with setbacks? Do you take the first 6 no's? Can you handle adversity? That's what I mean by motivation is sticking to the values and the mission, even under the harshest and hardest of circumstances. And then the 4th element is empathy. So none of us can ever truly know what it's like to be somebody else, but we ought to try. Because just by trying, we actually can connect, we can communicate, we have words and language. Empathy then should lead to social skill. That's the 5th and the crowning jewel of it all. And what I have found is when I worked really hard on developing emotional intelligence, because it can be developed. There was a period of time about 50
You don't think
years.
it's natural, Chris? You think it can be developed?
So 50 years ago, this is where the literature was. It was that leaders are just born, and that's the way it is. But we actually saw from scholarship that, it helps to come to the earth with certain strengths. Absolutely, it helps, right? But really, leadership is developed, and it's a commitment. So, for the listeners out there that are business owners, they know this. I mean, they have to commit to leader development because that's how they retain. That's how they see potential actually translate into action. And, many of them, many of your listeners maybe have been doing this intuitively because that's how they survived, right? It's Darwinian. Their company's still alive because of their smarts and because of their wits and their good choices. But I'm here to tell you this morning that they should feel good that their intuition is actually backed by data.
But I tell you,
Scott.
Chris, one thing that we run into the roadblock is that many owners are running the company, making a lot of those decisions. They build an executive team, but they really procrastinate on who's really going to take over their role, and they kick the can down the road. And now all of a sudden they're getting older. They have a health concern, or their spouse wants them to leave, and all of a sudden they're like, okay, I want to leave, but it takes years to really develop this. So I think the advice I'm hearing from you is start early in developing the succession plan, maybe in your 40s or 50s, knowing that the end game is several years away or longer, but need to have that team in place so that you can, at the last minute, relatively last minute, walk away from a business and have the leaders set in stone versus trying to build out a team at age 70 and you want to be out by 72. We're starting to see people kind of stay longer because this is their baby. They're selling their baby, which is a big deal for them. And that makes sense.
Absolutely. And by the way, we had a forcing function in my units. It's mostly because of the mortality. I mean, I had paratroopers killed in my command and combat. We had about 50, I think we had 52 wounded. I was among them. So you just never know so we had the reality. We had to face that reality. So what did we do as a forcing function? So when I was a brigade commander, for example, I would directly counsel, formally now, in writing, once a quarter, my battalion commanders. I had 6 of them. But here's what I mean by the forcing function. When they would meet with me for their formal quarterly counseling, keep in mind, they would get sometimes daily feedback from me, sort of like informal feedback, but they would get this written counseling once a quarter. But when they came for their counseling, they had to bring their counseling folders for their company commanders. So like when I gave written feedback to my battalion commanders, before we even start, we talked about their charges. So we'd spend probably the first third, sometimes even 40% of the counseling session talking about their leader development. So it was a forcing function in that they knew they couldn't skip it, right? Because then I'd want to see it. And there were a couple times when I had a battalion commander behind on the paperwork say, well, how do you think that I mean, I understand there's always a million reasons from Sunday not to do leader development. But at the end of the day, they would agree with me. It's none of them are actually worth a darn. You really got to do it. So that's what I'd recommend that to the listeners is think about how do you set up a forcing function in your company so that your charges, your direct charges, are also developing their direct charges. And I found this to work. By the way, it helped me when I actually would be in the training environment and meet a company or in combat, meet a company commander, which is, when I was a battalion commander, 2 levels below me, or brigade commander, 3 levels. I was aware because I'd had that counseling session with my direct charge, so I was aware where that company commander was
Yeah.
as far as their development.
That
Yeah.
makes sense. I mean, switching over to your time in Congress, I know that leadership is different in Congress, right? Because you're representing folks in upstate New York, and you're trying to vote on their behalf or represent them in every way, shape. But you're also negotiating, the Democrats, Republicans, negotiating deals, right? So I don't know if it's a slightly different skill set, not necessarily just leadership, but also, how does that transition? What traits kind of did you see people that succeeded in politics or in Congress have to make them rise to the top, whether they're Democrat or Republican?
Well, it's funny when I listen to you ask me that question. I think I'm staring at, somebody who does it really well, Jerry. I've seen you, uh, uh, I've seen you move in and out of crowds, very diverse, different type of crowds. And the one thing I notice about you is the first thing you do is you listen. You're listening to what people are saying. You're making eye contact with them, and you're affirming some of their points, but then questioning. Asking them out of your curiosity. These were all traits that were very important. I credit my mom. My mom and dad were like yin and yang. My dad was just he was a disciplinarian. I used to joke with my family and friends and say he was like colorblind. He didn't know the color gray. Everything was black or white. And my mom was so empathetic. I mean, she could just empathize with anybody. And it was really that skill set that helped me in Congress.
Well, you got both. So,
Well,
both sides.
yeah, I'd like to think maybe I do. I certainly fail every day. I try to get better. But to your point, I mean, look, I was in a district. I happened to be the first Republican in my family ever, and so I think coming from a working class family who were Irish Catholic Democrats helped connect with all folks. But then also what my mom showed me by her personal example. And I was in a district, the redistricting reformed my district, but my last 4 years, I was in a district that the party opposite. So Barack Obama, for example, he won my congressional district by 7 points. Yet a district that voted for Barack Obama, a Democrat, actually voted for me, in the same line. Ultimately I won by 30 points my last election. So clearly I was getting a lot of support. In fact, there's an article, October 30th of 2014, the front page of the New York Times did an article because they were scratching their head trying to figure out how is a country upstate conservative getting strong Democratic votes. And I think it goes to your point that your listeners, I mean, part of what they have to do is make hard choices. They have varying clientele. You guys have to figure it out too. I mean, and this emotional intelligence that I talked about earlier is the thing that really helped me most of all. I mentioned about empathy is, and in fact, what some people reported to that reporter from the New York Times, literally, this is one of the quotes from the article, if anybody wants to look it up, from October 30th of 2014, said, look, I only agree with Gibson. I think they said 2 out of 10 times, but I'm voting for him because 2 things. One is I trust him. And the second is on those 2 issues we agree on, nobody works harder. So, I mean, there's ways to bring people together. And unfortunately, that's part of the challenge we're having right now in this country is we can't even get past step 1, which is just listening and forming bonds. Even if, like I used to tell folks when I showed up, when I was first meeting them and they knew I had an R in front of my name, they thought I had horns growing out of my head. And, I used to listen and they'd say, this didn't go like I thought. I thought this was going to be really like vitriolic. And I said, well, politics are important, but they don't define me. I'm also I'm a husband and I'm a father. I'm a Mets fan and a Jets fan. There's a lot of different things
We're
that
sorry. We're sorry about those two, but
I don't. By the way, if you haven't taken up that habit, don't take it up.
yeah.
It's not for the weak of faint of heart. You know this with the Jets, Jerry.
So Chris,
But
I know you put a lot of time into making decisions. You don't make rash decisions. And I think your decision, and you have to remind me of the year, was that you were going to run against Governor Cuomo in the governorship of New York is a pretty big decision because it went to the press, it went to PR, it was all over the news. Tell us a little bit about how you kind of came to that decision that you wanted to do that, and then what was your decision to kind of step away from that?
So, well, look, as I term limited myself from the very beginning in the Congress. I believe the founders were right on this, that we weren't meant to have a permanent political class. We were meant to be self-governing. And for them, that meant you serve for a season and then you go back to your community. So after 6 years in the U.S. House, having never been defeated, I was term limiting myself, and I had many people here in my state that were urging me to run for governor. I mean, frankly, I wasn't sure that I'd want to do that, but in respect for them, who had financially supported me and had great faith in me, I said, I'll look at it. And so technically what I did, Jerry, is I formed what's called an exploratory committee. Said I'd look under the hood. I'd take a look at it. So I never actually declared a candidacy for governor. I did form an exploratory committee. I looked at it, and ultimately I decided, no, this is not the right choice. I thought, first of all, I was in a place where at that time my son really needed more time for me. He's now doing exceptionally well. But, between going directly from the Army, where I had these combat tours, and then going right to Congress, where I was flying to Washington every week, he was a mid-teenager, and he really needed his dad. I looked at that. And also, I looked at the job of governor of New York, and I'm like, well, really my whole life when it comes to thinking broadly about matters of representation in government was focused at the federal level. I'd studied the founding. I took a doctorate to teach at West Point. It was in government, but almost 100% it was on federal issues. So I really was not, I think, I didn't have the experience at the state level, which those issues are different. They're not dramatically different, but they are different. And ultimately, I decided for a variety of reasons that I would take a pass on it. So, what I did is, this also surprised some folks, is when I decided, after having explored it for a couple months, and I decided I wasn't going to run, I sent the money back. I mean, people are like, what the heck is this? We've never
You
had a
didn't have to send it back?
No, I could have kept it. And that's what people said. They said most politicians, when we send the money, we never get it back.
It's not most. I think it's 99.9.
That's why they were shocked. And, I said, well, look, I mean, if I'm not going to run, I should refund you. And so, I mean, I think I'd spent like 15%. So I refunded 85% of what they sent me, because in 2 months it cost me a little bit of money to explore. But I sent them a refund for 85% of what they sent me, and it floored people. Because again, it's totally within the law that you can keep it, because maybe you'll run for something else down the line. And, I go into it in greater detail in my book, The Spirit of Philadelphia, but it is one element of the corruption, in my view, is the money in politics. It's part of the problem. So ultimately, Jared, to answer your question, I mean, I looked at it, I just didn't believe it was the right call for myself, nor even for the state. So I basically closed up my exploratory committee and refunded my donors.
No, that's great. That's a good story. I'm glad you made all that clear, Chris. That's great. On a lighter note, what is your favorite bourbon? You do have a bourbon favorite, don't you?
Well, I mean, look, my dad was a Jameson drinker. It's Irish whiskey, but,
Yep.
Basically it's close. I mean, so I would say, I kind of tend towards that. Single malt Scotch too, of course,
Sure.
would be nice. But, I respect our American bourbon. And we actually have a place in our county that's also got good American bourbon. It's called Hill Rock. It's a bit boutique right now, but I'm telling you, the scores really well. But that's a great American bourbon. But my cultural prejudices are showing here that it's the Irish that really comes to the fore.
Jameson.
The
That's right.
Jameson.
And
Yeah.
are you optimistic on the Jets this year? We have an opening day against Aaron Rodgers and the Steelers, as you probably know.
Yeah. Now, look, I want to be, and I'll always be a Jets fan. There's no question on that. But I mean, how many years in a row has this just been really tough? So I guess I'd say I have managed expectations. I'm always hopeful to a degree, but I never let them break my heart again. When I was very young, this happened. Now I'm still faithful, but I'm guarded in my heart. So look, I mean, Aaron Glenn, did I have the highest regard and respect for him as a player? Of course I did. I mean, here's a disciplined guy who gives his all tough, and has, I think, done well as an assistant coach through the ranks. So, look, I would love for the Jets to really pivot. And, I'll just make the analogy with the Mets. I mean, 24 was supposed to be a complete rebuilding year for the Mets. I mean, that's why Scherzer asked to be traded. He said, well, if you guys aren't going to compete for the World Series, I want to be gone. And the Mets sort of let go of Verlander and Scherzer. Who knew? The Mets came back in the second half of 2024, beat the Dodgers, a couple games in the pennant, and had played way over expectations. So I'm kind of hoping the Jets are the same way this year. I mean, nobody's really making a call. I don't see that for them to make the playoffs, but hope.
Tough division.
Yeah, a tough division. And I say hope springs eternal, but hope falls eternal, maybe.
Yeah.
Thinking about the fall of this year.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this. You had a lot of great things to say, and I hope a lot of the business owners and centers of influence in the business middle market community really take to heart with what you said about succession planning and leadership. So,
Hey, Jared. Yeah,
great
listen,
knowledge.
thank you so much for this opportunity. And folks, I hope you check out my book, The Spirit of Philadelphia. I've got a website, The Spirit of Philadelphia. I hope you'll read it and think about it and then engage. I would love to hear from you after you've had a chance to read and think about it and engage with your family and friends. This is a time, I think, that the Republic, as we get ready to celebrate our Independence Day, I think it's very important to recover this spirit of Philadelphia. So the book, The Spirit of Philadelphia, I hope you read it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris.